on the critical issues that we'll be covering in the next 2 days. I want to especially thank the signature sponsor of today's event, the Idaho Forest Group. I've had the opportunity to tour the group's Chilco Mill twice this year. It's located just outside of Coeur d'Alene, and I was privileged to appear with Governor Otter at IDFG's annual meeting in March. I can tell you that what the Idaho Forest Group is doing as a leader in the timber industry is absolutely extraordinary. The technologies and conservation tools that they have developed and deployed are truly incredible. The Idaho Forest Group is a strong sponsor of Western Governors, and we're proud of its involvement with the WGA community. I'm also pleased to recognize and thank our federal partners, the U.S. Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, both of which are participating in the full scope of initiative activities and have provided generous financial support for the effort. We're also grateful for the contributions of the National Wild Turkey Federation, the American Sheep Industry Association, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and the Associated Logging Contractors. Public lands management. As a phrase, that sounds sort of dry and academic and bureaucratic. But what it connotes is rich and layered and interesting and wildly important. Because when we talk about land management, we're talking about nearly every activity that's undertaken on Western lands. We're talking about wildfire and firefighting and prevention and mitigation. We're talking about recreation, camping and hunting and fishing and hiking and skiing and biking and climbing and motorized exploration. We're talking about economic activity, grazing and timber, mining. And we're talking about nature and water quality and species diversity and conservation. In fact, we're talking about those very things that make the Western United States abundant and special and truly extraordinary. Western lands are marked by different ownership patterns and management regimes. Adjacent lands in the same biome can look, produce, and react very differently from one another depending on how they're being managed and by whom and for what purposes. In this initiative, by focusing on the steps that we can be taking to increase the overall health of our forests and rangelands, we're also taking steps to increase their resilience to wildfire and other threats like insects and disease and invasive species. We hope that these conversations will yield a number of recommendations on best management practices and tools that can help Western governors and the federal government and local communities to strengthen their forests and rangeland habitats, revitalize forest health, and help break the current vicious cycle of catastrophic wildfires. WGA is currently pursuing the second year of the Western Governors Species Conservation and Endangered Species Act initiative, an effort led by our immediate past chairman, the Honorable Matt Mead, Governor of Wyoming. When Governor Mead first indicated that he wanted to design a project around ESA, I asked him if we could take on something maybe a little less politically contentious, like peace in the Middle East. But he was determined because he recognized that no one is better situated or equipped to take on these difficult resource challenges than Western governors. The personal engagement of Western governors in that effort has been striking and invaluable because they set a tone of civility and collegiality that the Species Initiative participants adopted as their own. What has ensued has been the most constructive conversation around ESA among an incredibly diverse group of stakeholders. That same tenor of bipartisanship and collegiality is infusing these conversations about forest and rangeland management. Yes, we have different priorities and viewpoints and interests and recommendations, but let's trust that we're all motivated by a sincere desire to improve the health, protect the beauty, and ensure the abundance of our precious Western lands for generations to come. As has been said many times, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. There's no one better to kick off today's conversation than Idaho's own cowboy governor, the Honorable C.L. Butch Otter. The first time I introduced the governor, a former congressman, I speculated that he is more comfortable in the cowboy boots of his beloved Idaho than in the wingtips of Capitol Hill. After the presentation, he took me aside and he gently chided me. "Son," he said, "I never owned a pair of wingtips in my life." Governor Otter is the real deal. An avid outdoorsman, ranchman, and member of the Idaho Cowboy Association, he knows a thing or two about forest and rangeland management. That knowledge is on full display during his annual Idaho Trail Ride, for which he assembles land managers, government officials, and other stewards of the land to perform public land inspections from the back of a horse, and then to engage in sweeping and candid conversations about land management practices, challenges, threats, and opportunities. It is a remarkable event. And Governor Otter's command of the issues is breathtaking. Whether he's talking about forage production, fuel loading, rest rotation grazing, or Leptium papilliferum, slick spot peppergrass, thanks. The governor knows his stuff. Moreover, he's been a great leader in sharing his knowledge and his wisdom with his fellow governors. He has, for example, been a strong proponent of rangeland fire protection associations and has advised governors throughout the West as to their formation and benefits. He's also given his full-throated support for a rational and workable seed policy to assist in the restoration of rangeland. During his time as governor, Idaho has been one of the most effective proponents of good neighbor authority, which leverages state dollars and tools to prosecute projects on federal lands. We'll take a sharp look at some of Idaho's success stories over the next couple of days so that other Western states can steal a page or two from Idaho's playbook. The governor is a gracious host, a good man, and a true leader, not just at the State House, but in life. It is my honor to introduce the 32nd governor of the Gem State, a former chairman of the Western Governors Association, the Honorable C.L. Butch Otter.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that very gracious introduction. I have to say I could have listened to that all day. In fact, there for a little bit, I thought I was going to have to. It's great to be here with you, and it's great to be here representing the Western Governors Association. As governors, and I'm in my I'm closing out my 10th year. I've been 9 years and 10 months. And I found out very quickly in '07 when I first became governor, that there are effective organizations that you can belong to that actually get things done, other than just have meetings in very expensive places. And that association happened to be the Western Governors Association. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the National Governors Association that for a while I was a member of. But when the recession hit in '08, I asked every agency to take a look at organizations that were effective and they got something out of it and the cost was worth the value received. And if it wasn't, then to get out of them and quit paying the dues. And we estimated my cost at the National Governors Association was roughly $125,000 to $140,000 a year. That include travel and staying over and everything else. And, you know, $140,000 a plate dinner at the White House was a little much for me. So since that time, with the exception of one short year, I have not been a member of the National Governors Association. But in the cost versus value, in the worth that it received, as I looked around to the other governor organizations that you can belong to, the Northwest Governor, the Northern Governors Association, almost every direction on the compass, and some in between. There's an association that you pay dues to, you go to meetings, and do you accomplish anything? And so it came very quickly to us that the Western Governors Association actually had value received far in extent of the cost of it. It was a very effective organization. There isn't a Western Governors that I served under, and I served under a lot of them as chairman. My first one was John Huntsman from Utah, and my next one was Dave Friedenthal from Wyoming. And then I became, there was one other, I can't remember who that was. No, then it was me, then Christine Gregoire from Washington. And so as you can see, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, that's by purpose, that's on purpose. Every year it changes. But I sometimes would ask those folks, why do we change it? We seem to check our partisanship at the door. Whether we're in Wyoming or Montana or Washington or South Dakota, who I think will be the next chairman. Dennis Dugart from South Dakota will be the next chairman. No matter where we were, we didn't end up in a lot of partisan fights and a lot of partisan debate. And because we wanted to get something positive done. And so one of the reasons that we're setting this up, and I tell you, I must tell you that I appreciate you all for being here, because this gives me a chance to put on the record what Idaho does. And then I want to share that experience with other states so that they can do the same thing. And then when they have it in Wyoming, has Matt had one already? Who else is having one? Hawaii, you're going to Hawaii. Tell me.
That was a species conservation.
Oh, yeah.
Governor Bullock.
So they're having one in Hawaii. And anyway, for us to share our experiences and how we went about it, what kind of collaboration did we, the federal agencies, at least those people representing those agencies on the ground in the West that drink our water and attend our churches and live in our neighborhoods, are not our enemy. And it took me a long time, having been in Congress, 14 years as lieutenant governor, 4 years in the state legislature. I always thought it was the enemy. And maybe some of those agencies that east of the Mississippi River don't understand as well as we would like them to. But I can tell you, we have advocates when they become part of our neighborhood, when they become part of our community, and many of them are represented right here. And I think, Jim, you're gonna follow me. When they become part of our community, they also are part of our culture. They're part of our value systems, and they're part of our vision. And so it's important that we share those Western experiences, and that's precisely what I want you all to do today. The collaborative effect that we've had, as Jim said in my introduction, we've been very successful. And we've been successful because we've worked with the agencies, we've worked with the other interest groups, the other stakeholders within the state, and that's why we were first in line for the good neighbor policy. I have to tell you, when I was the chairman of the executive committee, which means I was the immediate past president, and I actually served 2 years in that because Christine Gregoire went out right after that. And I would tell you that I had a great meeting with Mr. Vilsack in his office. And I asked him at one point, and Bob Bonney was there. I think I mentioned this story before. Bob Bay, haven't I? Anyway, so we got to talking, and I said, listen, we, at the state level, our lands department in the state, we contract to protect 6.3 million acres in Idaho from fire. Well, why don't you let us manage that to prevent fire? Why can't we come to an agreement with, if all you want me to do is go put the fire out, you know, that's not a good attitude to have. That's not a good practice. But let me do stuff in that 6.3 million acres that will prevent fire, or that it will at least give us an opportunity at a fair shot at fighting a fair fire. I don't mind that. But if we've got some areas, and so anyway, a few years later, actually it was April of 2014, the agricultural bill was passed. And in that agricultural bill, it was set out very, very clear that they asked us to collaborate. They said to the governors in the West, they said, why don't you go into your forests and you find out how much is under threat of wildfire, of bug kill, of disease. And if you can then inventory those and come back to us and give us an idea precisely what you could do, either under the good neighbor policy or under the 2014 Ag Bill, we'll collaborate with you. We'll help with you. Well, we've heard that story before. How many times have we heard that story before? And so, but Vilsack was sincere. And he was very poignant at what exactly he wanted us to do. Well, I had great fortune because under Dave Greshel at the state lands, Dave had already been working with collaborative groups in all of the national forests within Idaho. So we were readied up. We already knew where the problems were. And I think we had to deliver that memo on the 28th day of March of 2014. no, pardon me, on the, it was the first week of April of 2014, and we delivered ours. We were the first one to get ours in of, okay, here, out of this 21 million acres, 3 million acres of wilderness, so that's out of the question. So out of the 18 million acres that we've got left, we think we've got about 12 million acres that are of concern. But of that 12 million acres, we got 1,800,000 acres that are under serious threat. And so we presented that on the 28th day of March, 10 days, I think, something like that, in advance of where the drop dead date was. You didn't get a chance. So we were the first in there. We were the first in there because we'd already kind of been planning on it. Where are our problems? And thanks to Dave and those collaborative groups, we now have 1,800,000 acres, and we've just finished our first sale of 212 acres. That's not a big one, but what it gives, it's giving us an opportunity to prove our value, that we know what we're doing, and that we can help the federal agencies protect those values. And I think the Wapiti, it was the Wapiti sale, wasn't it? The Wapiti sale, I just love saying it, that's why I keep repeating myself, was a success. We cruised the timber, we selected the species, we selected the harvest logistics and the mechanism for it. We did everything in our own State Department. And it's going to be a great success. But more important, it's the fulfillment of a promise. And the promise was from Secretary Vilsack, if you'll go in and if you will be responsible for what your plans are, then we will be ready to accept that. And the Western governors took Mr. Vilsack at his word, and he has kept his word. And we're the first to prove it right here in Idaho. Now I understand that Steve Bullock has got 2 projects going as well. We have 50 out of that 1,800,000 acres. We got 50 projects, right, David? Pardon me? 50 proposed treatment. Yes. Well, yeah, 50 proposed treatment areas. I have to learn that terminology. I'm from Canyon County. That's kind of hard to do. So. But anyway, my point is this, is that we're going to be able to go to the next Western Governors Conference with all of the ideas that you all throw into the pot, and we render those down into actionable items. If you'd asked me when I was in Congress if this was possible, I'd say you got to be smoking something up in Washington or Oregon or over in Colorado, because that isn't going to happen as far as I'm concerned. But it did happen. And it happened because reasonable people met in a reasonable place and decided to do the reasonable thing. And that is collaborate instead of fight. So the information that we get here, the information that you all give us, will then become inventoried for the pursuit of the next action plan that we'll have here in Idaho. The other thing we're doing is we're going to examine those things that every state's doing. Every state's a little bit different. You know, within our borders, we're much different than, even though we're connected to Montana and Wyoming and Utah, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and Canada. I would tell you we all do something a little bit different because we do it the way that our lands lay, or the way the species are that we have, or with the manufacturing facilities that we have, the use of the products that we have. And so we have to do things a little bit different. Every one of our harvests is going to be on a watershed. It's not going to be necessarily that way in other states, but we have folks that are born, they spend their whole life on that watershed, they die and they're buried on that watershed. So we live on all the watershed here in Idaho. And we got a lot of it. I used to tell Rick Perry, who was at one time also the chairman of the Western Governors, you know, he always bragging about Texas, how big it was. And I said, listen, Rick, if we flattened Idaho out to 1,500 feet above sea level, we'd be bigger than the state of Texas. So shut the hell up. Now, we're not going to do that. But I would tell you, that's a lot of landmass. And that's a lot of value to the state of Idaho, because it's also our habitat for our game. It's our place where we recreate. It's our place where we work and earn a living and raise a family and send kids to college and buy houses and be an important part of the economy. And so That's why it's important that we share those experiences and what we've been successful at. We've had some things that weren't so successful. And I'd be the first to admit it. And so we also want to bring those up. And if you've got some where we weren't successful, bring them up. You know, somebody a lot smarter than I once said that to try and fail is at least to learn, but to fail to try is to suffer that unestimable cost of what might have been. And so there is no unestimable cost that I want us to avoid, because there's a lot of things that could be. Maybe a lot won't, but there's some things that are going to come out of here, this that can be, and we need to share those with absolutely everybody else. You also mentioned, Jim, my volunteer groups out in the Grays area. I don't know if you'll remember, those in Idaho, those familiar with the middle of the state. My first big fire was the Murphy Complex fire, 700,000 acres of desert land that burned. But it was also habitat for slick spot peppergrass. It was also habitat which was on the watch it real close list. The pygmy rabbit, bull trout. How we had so many things. We didn't know how many things we had out there. But it was all habitat that was destroyed as a result of that fire. And we had a couple of ranchers and farmers that took the initiative themselves and went out and said, we're gonna at least block that fire and keep it off of our private property, and hopefully keep it off of some of our grounds that we've got some animal unit leases on. And so we're going to take that action. Well, they got sued. And they got sued because they weren't allowed to do that. But at one point, we found out that in Duck Valley, just outside of the Duck Valley Reservation, we had a cat sitting on a lowboy that we could have immediately attacked, been the initial attack on that fire, but we didn't have somebody there to say, you can safely back that. I don't know who the hell put it on that lowboy, but probably wasn't qualified to get it off. Because they said you can't unload that lowboy until we have our safety officer here to see you unload it. Now, 5,000 acres was the size of that fire at the time. Could have we stopped it? I don't know, but I can speculate. I know what we didn't, because it burned another 695,000 acres. Maybe we could have stopped it someplace. So that's when we created these volunteer folks, the folks that live in the resource. Actually came forward and said, you know, I live out there. When I see a lightning strike, I look for smoke. And if I see a little whiff of smoke going up, I'll get my pickup and go out and check it. And I'm not too far away from maybe getting something and attack that fire and put it out small like it will be, and keep it small like it should be, instead of wasting the resource. And so I said, that's a hell of an idea. So 2 years, the next year or 3 years, how long ago, John, did we start that? 4 years ago. 4 years ago. You don't know that. You just said that because I asked you. I think it was 4 years ago, because now we have 7, 8. How many do we have, Lori?
You've got 8.
8. We've got 8. And so what we did is we put up $150,000, and we went to the BLM and Interior and everybody else that trains those folks. And we said, why don't you train this rancher and his family and his neighbor and the other folks that live out there in the resource? Why don't you train them so we can get that lowboy off that, or we can get that cat off that lowboy, so that we can go out and attack that fire. Their concern was obvious. Their concern is what we have anytime we're initial attack on a fire, or anytime we're fighting a fire, and that's the safety of those firefighters. We don't want anybody hurt. We don't want anybody killed. We've had some bad incidences in the United States. We don't want any more of that. And I, for sure, don't want any of it in Idaho. And so we trained up that first group, $150,000 through federal surplus, through maybe even some state surplus. We were able to buy the equipment that was necessary for initial attack on a fire. And we created the association. And it was all volunteer. It was all from these folks. And then we created 2 more the next year. And then, well, now we're up, as Lori says, to 8 in the state. And we've got a pretty massive, I've seen the map. Stephen had the map. But we've got a pretty massive land area that now has protection. Are we going to get them all? No, but we got a lot of them already. And we've kept them down from burning 700,000 acres and a lot of habitat and creating a lot of problems for us. And so we want to keep that up. Well, the first thing I heard was from Dennis Dugard. And actually it was Secretary Jewell said, you know, that's a great idea. Why don't, and she comes to almost every Western governor's meeting. And she said, that's a great idea. Why don't we share that with other states? And I think that was when I only had a couple. But they found out that they could work together, that they didn't have to fight, that they weren't the enemy, that they were actually the friend and they were the neighbor and they were the person that they'd see in the grocery store and in church on Sunday, and that sort of thing. And so it really built a community of interest and a community of concern. So the other thing we're always fighting is it seems like we know the cost of everything, but are unable sometimes, debilitated from assessing the value. I can tell you the cost of a lot of stuff, but when people start explaining value to me, then I get interested. And so as we check each one of these ideas that you have, we're going to check them for cost and value. But we're not going to be debilitated from assessing the value because the cost seems like a little too much or a little out of the ordinary. Our collaboration with the federal agencies, I think, has been a record as far as I'm concerned, at least in my lifetime. In all of the offices that I've held in the private sector, where I seem to always be at odds with some federal inspector, whether it was OSHA or EPA or whatever it was. You've heard my story on the Army Corps of Engineers, so I'm not going into that one. But I would tell you this, that seeing the private sector, Bob Bay and Mark Brinkmeyer's company and those folks coming in and putting money on the line, and then seeing the federal folks matching that, and seeing the collaboration that we've had in our first sale, does my heart good. It was something I never ever thought I would see. I thought my kids and my grandkids would be fighting the same battles that I fought. And so we're setting a good example because we're sharing our examples. We're setting a good example because we're counting on and dependent on the leadership from every state group, whether it's the environmental community or whether it's the state community or whether it's the federal community. We're all working on this together. And so I couldn't be more proud of the fact that the Western Governors Association, under the leadership of Steve Bullock of Montana, was able to step forward and say, no, we're going to take this on. Because as Jim said, I know when Matt Mead, his initial concern was, Jim actually said, well, why don't we solve the war in the Middle East first before we take this on? Because that is probably more accomplished. Opportunity to accomplish than this. Not true. Not true. Folks, I say again, I couldn't be more proud that you were all here, that you're willing to share your day, your experiences, your life experiences, and then put all of those things together and come up with an action plan. You put an action plan together, and I'll guarantee you the Western Governors Association will spend every ounce of effort that we can to make sure that they're implemented. And that's probably the final thing that I'm asking. As we put those action plans together, Jim and his crew out of Colorado have been very, very successful at getting the Western governors in front of the Resources Committee, in front of the Ag Committee, in front of those committees in Washington, D.C., so we get a chance to tell our story. And our story is one that is of cooperation, able to go forward and forget about the cost sometimes and concentrate on the value. And that's what we're going to take to Congress. So we'll probably be calling on you again to maybe even when you get an opportunity to talk to a congressman, when you get an opportunity to talk to a senator, you do it. And you do it with all of the hope and all of the help and all of the opportunity that the Western Governors Association and these meetings that we can record and put on the record, and we'll do it proudly. And we thank you for that. And so now it's my opportunity. Jim, You're on next. Or are you going to introduce Jim?
Jim can just, I'll just introduce you.
Here's Jimmy.
I just want to be clear, I've never owned any wingtips either, so. Well, Governor, I always enjoyed hearing your remarks, and I want to say how much we appreciate the partnership with the state of Idaho. And I do recall the conversation on Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, because Sally talked to you and then turned to me and said we ought to do that, and we built it into her secretarial order, and it's part of the strategy. And they've expanded now to Nevada, Utah, and Oregon. So,
South Dakota?
South Dakota, I think South Dakota's just starting this year. So one illustration of the value of collaboration. So I want to certainly want to thank you, Governor Otter, for the opportunity to be back in Idaho. Love coming here. And I want to thank WGA and Jim and Holly in particular for all the work that they continue to do. And I want to also recognize the former and current chairs of WGA, who have really been instrumental, I think, in bringing a dialogue to some critical Western issues. Governor Sandoval with his initiative on drought, Governor Mead focusing on endangered species, and now Governor Bullock focusing on forest and rangeland health, I think, bring a really needed dialogue among many varied interests on some really, really important topics affecting the Western landscape. And I know, Jim, you've helped kind of organize and put these together, so I thank you for doing so. You know, these are important issues, and I hope that these discussions, including the discussion that will happen here and through this initiative, will help frame some of the solutions that are desperately needed for some of the issues that the Western landscape and Westerners face. And there'll be opportunities ahead. New administration certainly will come out with new initiatives, whoever that may be. A farm bill is not far down the road, and I sense there'll be many opportunities to step up. So I look forward to the products of this dialogue. I want to focus on three things in my comments today. First, I want to emphasize something that the governor's already pointed to, and that is our Western landscapes are undergoing significant change. They're brought about by many factors: drought, fire, invasive species, increasing pressure of expanding population, which I hope I'll be a part of at some point here in Idaho, and development. And I think these pressures, these challenges cry out for new vision, new strategies, and really leadership that's committed to the kind of solutions that are needed to help the communities that depend on these resources and to help these invaluable public lands. Second, I think I want to emphasize the fact that I think more and more the work we're doing, this conversation, places an emphasis on the need for us to put people back into conservation. In the past, I think we've tended often, too often, to really focus on the physical attributes of conservation, to focus on lands to be protected and lands to be designated as working lands and the like. And we failed to bring the communities associated with these lands, dependent upon these lands, who know these lands, who have a love for these lands, to be a central part of that dialogue. And I think we need to move in a different direction there. And third, I want to emphasize the fact that in that context, stewarding the Western landscape, national forests, public lands, state lands, private lands, really is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility that I think affords us a tremendous opportunity to find ways to work together as partners to ensure safe and healthy landscapes and a sustainable future. So I want to first emphasize a bit the rapidly changing Western landscapes and what we need to do about it. Forests and rangelands across the West are being impacted by a whole host of threats: invasive species, cheatgrass and medusa head, an issue we've come to deal with a great deal in the sage grouse effort, the impacts of drought, insect and disease impacting millions and millions of acres of forested land, and of course fire. Add to that growing communities, expanding agriculture, and energy development, both traditional and non-traditional, affecting habitat and really changing the nature of the Western landscape. Some of this is the result of our changing climate, some is the product of economic development, and some is simply the result of people living on crowded coastlines who decided that they want their piece of open space on these landscapes. What's important to recognize is that these changes and their potential impacts can be addressed if we work together to try and plan for growth, so that we can manage that growth sustainably, so that we can provide the needed economic benefits for communities, and so that we can help each other share in the wealth and the benefit of a healthy landscape. We can do that through collaboration. As for the impacts of invasive insects and disease and fire, these are not simply public land issues, I think, as everyone knows. They affect private lands. They affect state lands. They're, in fact, not issues that are in any way governed by geopolitical boundaries or administrative jurisdiction. They're resource issues that have to be dealt with as a whole. And I think if we commit together to work on these issues in that context, I think we're going to be successful in addressing them. I'd suggest, in fact, that the solution to many of the challenges that we address can be achieved if we simply make a collective commitment to work to restore and maintain the health of our forests and rangelands. The research has shown that healthy landscapes are more resilient to impacts of climate, drought, and fire. Healthy landscapes improve habitat and connectivity. Thus, they reduce the risk to species and the likelihood of them becoming threatened or endangered. And healthy landscapes improve water resources, which in turn benefit fish and wildlife, and ultimately people. The tools and the technologies that we need to map and monitor and evaluate the health of our lands, the impacts of a changing landscape, and the effectiveness of the policies and management decisions that we make are more and more available. Certainly a great deal more available than they were when I first started in this business. We have GIS platforms, we have satellite imagery, we have drones, we have monitoring devices, and we have modeling capability. What we need to do is we need to share the wealth of this technology and research and information as a foundation for developing the prescriptions that are going to help to restore the health of these landscapes. And I'd suggest that that is one place where the federal government in particular, can play a critical role. In this way, we can work together to deal with the challenges facing Western states to everyone's benefit. And that brings me to my second point. In the work we've done together, especially in our efforts to conserve the greater sage grouse, I believe we framed really a new paradigm for conservation, one that's founded on landscape-level, science-based collaborative conservation. Successful efforts really over almost a decade, going back to the initial work done by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, led to the not warranted decision that really was the beneficiary of this new approach. And leadership was demonstrated among federal and state agencies and many, many stakeholders. Former Secretary Salazar, followed by Secretary Jewell, working with Governor Meade and Governor Hickenlooper through the Sage Grouse Task Force, really led the charge. And that task force continues to work to bring together varied interests, to have conversations about how we can work together to further our efforts to conserve sage grouse, but also to address the issues associated with the sagebrush ecosystem. That's not to say that there aren't a few remaining issues. And I recognize, since I'm here in Idaho, that we might have a few differences that remain. But nevertheless, if you think about it, we've been along a long journey. And I think we should be very proud of what we've been able to accomplish. And I would say it's largely been a successful effort thus far. And I think it is a model that we can follow into the future. In fact, I'd suggest that in reading the summary of Governor Meade's Species Conservation and Endangered Species Initiative, some important points have been emphasized that really were core to the work we did on sage grouse. Landscape level conservation and ecosystem management, investments in science and measurable outcomes, incentivizing proactive voluntary conservation, a role that was really amplified and benefited from the Sage Grouse Initiative and the work of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and recognizing certainly the role of state and local governments. I think what's important is bringing people together to understand each other's concerns, to share information and expertise, to build strategies that are founded on the needs and innovation of individuals, communities, and state and federal officials. And this is what we did with the sage grouse strategy. In adopting the core area strategy in Wyoming, the SageCon strategy in Oregon, and the three-tiered habitat structure here in the state of Idaho. Each were built on science, were built on healthy collaboration, and reflective of the needs and resource conditions in each state. This effort provided the foundation for what eventually became a range-wide ecosystem sage grouse conservation strategy, and as I said earlier, a rather successful one. Now to my final thought. Demonstrating our ability to collaborate, which Governor Otter has emphasized, and which I think this meeting will bring even more attention to. Demonstrating our ability to collaborate across landscapes, across political jurisdictions, and administrative boundaries really is not only fundamental to good conservation. I'd suggest it's fundamental to reaffirming our collective commitment to democracy. I think regardless of the outcome of this election, emerging from the current presidential election, there will be an important need to heal the wounds of a very, very difficult campaign. Perhaps in working together to restore the health of our landscapes, we can also begin to heal our democracy and restore our commitment to the democratic principles upon which this nation was founded. To this point, I spoke earlier about resilient landscapes in the context of ecological communities. But, you know, when we think of communities, I think we all really think about people and the people that reside in those communities. In the West, this concept is all the more powerful because of the generations that have lived in some of these communities and have managed lands that were managed by their fathers and their grandfathers and their grandfathers before that. I think Governor Otter emphasized that with his example of the watershed. What's important is we find ways to build resilient economies to sustain rural communities and the natural resources that they rely on. To this point, some interesting research has been done by the Kettering Foundation, whose mission is to find ways to increase citizen participation in society by asking the question, what does it take to make democracy work? Recently, they reported the following. They said, when we looked at the key variables that determine a local economy's resilience, the collective citizenry is in fact implicated in nearly all of the things that allow a community to bounce back. Experts in economic development say regions and communities that do well have a sense of possibility, a conviction that they can meet any challenge. Their citizens have developed the skills and habits of working together. Their culture encourages innovation and enterprise. They experiment, learning as they go. And they have networks and associations that link people in a free flow of communications. In short, having the skills and habits of working together encourages innovation, enterprise, and learning together in these regions and economies. It's been demonstrated are more sustainable. So I'd add to this the comments of Dan Kemmis, former mayor of Missoula, Montana, who wrote a great book called Politics of Place. In it, Dan said, our loss of capacity for public life, which impedes our ability to resolve crucial issues, parallels our loss of a sense of place, a renewed sense of inhabitation, of community rooted in place, and of people dwelling in that place in a practiced way, can shape politics into a more cooperative and more humanly satisfying enterprise. Place, as we all know, is a very powerful concept, and the notion of conservation is clearly connected to place, as we've seen in all the successful collaborative efforts across the West. So imagine if, through collaborative conservation, a focus on the protection and restoration of forest and rangeland health, we could also help to heal communities, whole regions, and perhaps project by project, place by place, our democracy as a whole. Maybe that idea is a little too grandiose, but imagine the power of building resilient communities for the benefit of the health of the land, but also for the benefit of the greater community of people who inhabit or connect to that place. And everyone in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about. I would suggest that this is potentially one of the greatest outcomes of this initiative. And to amplify that thought, I'm going to close with comments from Governor Bullock when he announced this initiative in Jackson, Wyoming. I guess it was this past summer. This is what the governor said. He said, quote, at a time when it doesn't seem that popular to work together, At a time when talking over people appears more valued than talking to one another. At a time where railing against the federal government is more commonplace than doing the hard work of striving to find any degree of common ground to advance our state's interests. At this odd time, in all these aspects, here we are, striving to find those commonalities and advance the interests of all citizens in the West. The governor was speaking directly to the governors of WGA. He went on to say, it's no surprise that when we engage with each other on policy issues, we're trying our hardest to find common ground for common sense solutions when sometimes it might have been a lot easier to give up. A great man once said, the only problem with common sense is it's not all that common. I think we can overcome that if we continue this kind of dialogue and continue our commitment to work together. I'm quite convinced that Governor Bullock is not giving up, nor is our current governor, Governor Otter. I'm sure as hell sure of that. I can tell you, nor am I. There are exciting opportunities ahead. A new administration, regardless of who that is, offers us all opportunities to take what we've learned, to take what we understand from the dialogue here, from what's been learned from the ESA initiative, and really build a new agenda to help us move forward in a collective and collaborative way for the good of the resources that we manage and for the good of the communities and others who are sorely interested in the health of those landscapes. As I said, there are exciting opportunities ahead, so let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Thank you.